Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I think last week I spoke about, in part, I spoke about the horrors of samsara and the wheel of rebirth, and that may have had an effect of a depressive effect on people. Probably a salutary effect to remind you once in a while, but I think this week I'm going to change gears and talk about the role of happiness in practice. First point to make is that the Buddhist teachings often get from the outside, they often get a reputation of being gloomy or pessimistic. I recall being asked, once I gave a public talk somewhere, and somebody asked me, how come you Buddhists always talk about suffering all the time? And I said, that's not fair. We talk about other things. We talk about pain, lamentation, grief, and despair. But, that's a flippant answer. But the reality is, looking at the First Noble Truth, part of the issue that comes up with people taking this impression of Buddhism as being a gloomy religion is the translation of First Noble Truth, the translation of dukkha as suffering. Suffering works in some context and in some way, but it's not an exact translation of dukkha. Dukkha is broader than just suffering. In the human condition, we're constantly bombarded by sense impression, sense contact, and the mind experiences these as either pleasure or neutral or painful. And all three of these are dukkha, but it's not correct. It's misleading to think that all three are suffering. Dukkha implies something broader than suffering. It includes suffering, but it relates to the brokenness, the imperfection of conditional occurrences. That every event, every phenomena that arises in samsara is somewhat imperfect, somewhat broken, somewhat provisional. One of the explanations given in the Visuddhimagga for the etymology of the word dukkha is like off-center or askew, in that using the analogy or the image of an axle wheel that has been made imperfectly, so that the central hole in the wheel that the axle goes through is off. It's not a perfect circle. It's wrongly shaped, so that when the axle goes along the road, the wheel's always bouncing and banging, and it rides crookedly and roughly. This is really the meaning of dukkha, is the imperfection or the unsatisfactory nature of things, and it's also to be understood that dukkha is actually objective rather than subjective. It's inherent in the nature of the objects themselves. It's not something that we impose with our minds. And sometimes you get this misinterpretation as well, which is kind of like Voltaire's Candide. This is the best of all possible worlds. This is not what the Buddha taught. And I said this world is imperfect because it's conditioned. It's in a sense always a work in progress, never finished, never perfect. It's not. That's not something we impose on reality with our mind. That's inherent in the nature of reality itself. And if we don't see that, if we impose a perfection or a satisfaction in the world, then that's a misapprehension. That is a misapprehension of the mind, not the reverse. So the dukkha occurs with all three feeling tones. Dukkha that occurs with painful sensation is dukkha dukkhata. That's inherently dukkha, or dukkha per se. That's the obvious case. That's the case where the English word suffering applies pretty exactly. You get a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. That's clearly unpleasant, painful sensation. That's dukkha in that sense. Dukkha associated with neutral feeling is dukkha sankhata. This is dukkha of as a characteristic. So it's inherent. It's in a more abstract sense. It's inherent in the nature of the object. It's not experienced subjectively as suffering, but the object is inherently imperfect and provisional. Dukkha viparinama is a dukkha associated with pleasant feeling, with pleasure. This is dukkha of changeableness, because pleasure is always transient. It's never complete. This is the important aspect to understand about pleasant sensation, is that it can never satisfy the mind. It can please the mind momentarily. There is such a thing as pleasant sensation. There is pleasure that arises as a feeling tone that can come from sense objects. But this is inherently impermanent, inherently unsatisfying. There's no object in conditioned reality that will satisfy the mind completely and put the mind at rest. The mind is always seeking, desiring pleasant objects. And when the pleasant object is attained, it gives a momentary hit of pleasant feeling, pleasant tone, but this, by its nature, it cannot put the mind at rest or satisfy the mind. The object itself eventually falls away, but even before it falls away, it's incomplete. It's not fully satisfying. The mind is still wanting, needing more, needing something else, needing the next new thing. So this is one form of, and the lowest form of pleasant feeling is that associated with sense objects. There's a line in one of the chants of one of the blessing chants, transference of merit chant, that speaks of the threefold bliss. May all beings enjoy the threefold bliss. This refers to three grades of happiness that the mind can experience. the first of these is worldly happiness, that is, happiness derived from sense contact, pleasant sensations in the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. Now these are experienced as pleasant, sukha vedana, pleasant mental feeling. But as explained, they're incomplete, imperfect, and actually relatively shallow compared to the other grades of happiness. The second grade, or the intermediate grade of sukha vedana, is that associated with deep meditation, with Jhana. And this can be subdivided into two levels, piti and sukha. And this is a natural occurrence in the mind when the mind comes to stability. This is why it can be said that the state of bliss is a more natural or primordial state of mind than state of agitation or unhappiness, or any of the more shallow emotional states. That the natural state of the mind, when it's unconstrained, when it's at rest, is more blissful. And what keeps us from experiencing that is the hindrances, the nivaranas, the 5 hindrances. The first of which is sense desire, chasing after sense objects. And as long as the mind is engaged in seeking satisfaction and pleasant feeling through the senses, it can't come to that deep stability that allows for rest in the jhana and experiencing of the deeper happiness. Because this is the stability of deep samadhi is a new kind of a new level of consciousness. It's a quantum shift. It's a major phase change in consciousness from sense desire realm, which is inherently busy, inherently diverse, multiple, shifting, with many variations, constantly moving, constantly changing, shifting. And that's the default mode of human beings. That's the ordinary day-to-day mind of human beings. But underlying that, a deeper state of mind, when the mind is not involved with that, it naturally rests in this samadhi, which allows the arising of the deeper states of happiness. The Buddha once encountered a Jain ascetic who was involved in some practices of self-mortification, torturing the body to burn off old karma and attain enlightenment, and got into a dialogue with this fellow, and amongst other back and forth disputes, the Jain at one point says, well, your path is that one can attain liberation through pleasure, or we hold that one attains liberation through pain. If your path were correct, then why is not King Bimbisara, who is surrounded by the 5-fold sense pleasures constantly, why is he not an arahant? and taking King Bimbisara as a type of a human being who has access to satisfying all the sensual desires that one can imagine. Comfort, good food, pleasant surroundings, plenty of beautiful women, music, anything that one can imagine. Indian Maharajas were probably amongst those human beings who ever lived on this planet who had the most exquisite sense experiences. And the Buddha's reply was that King Bimbisara's experience of pleasure is nothing compared to what he experiences. The Buddha said, I can sit for 9 days wrapped in the highest bliss without moving a muscle. Can King Bimbisara do that? So that even the pleasures of a Indian Maharaja that cannot be compared to, is the summit. This is a type of the summit of sensual enjoyment, even in the human level. Even that cannot be even remotely compared to the happiness, second grade of happiness, the happiness experienced in Jhana, when the mind is completely immersed in bliss. The third jhana, the image is, and the metaphor is a lotus growing in the water that doesn't break the surface of the water, so that the entire plant is seeped inside and out in the water of the pond, the water being bliss, sukha vedana. The third grade is actually only to be considered as happiness or bliss in a metaphorical sense, because this is the bliss of nibbana, which is beyond bliss. The actual consideration of happiness or bliss doesn't apply when it has gone beyond such considerations. Because even the experience of jhana is still conditioned, it's still samsaric. It's still impermanent. Even though in the case of one who masters jhana and is reborn as a Brahma god, one might experience bliss for hundreds of kapas, that's still impermanent. But the experience of nibbana is akaliko, is timeless. It's not related to time. So it's not impermanent. This is a point to contemplate, to consider, that when the attributes of nibbana are spoken of, it's always in the negative. So nibbana is called amata, deathless, and it's called timeless, akaliko, but it's never referred to as anicca, permanent. We have anicca, is impermanence. So if it was to be considered to be some kind of eternalism within time, it would be called nicca. But it is not. So any kind of experience of conditionality is always, by nature of being conditioned, it's inherently impermanent, and it's inherently unsatisfying to the mind. And it's also inherently void of real substance. It's empty. So moving the mind from the ordinary state to the state of sense desire realm, into the realm of form, the jhanic experience is not a complete liberation, but it's a movement in the direction of less encumbrance. It's like you've shed one whole layer of samsaric becoming, one whole layer of conditionality without losing the whole. But it simplified matters to a great degree. So why do beings continue? Why is it so hard for beings to find this release? One big reason is attachment to the known. This is what we're used to, this is what's familiar. And the inability to imagine, to contemplate something else. It's like the parable of the tortoise and the fish. The tortoise sometimes swims in the water, sometimes crawls on land. The fish is always in the water. And the tortoise and the fish make friends in the water, and they're talking together. And then one time the fish sees the tortoise, and he says, "Oh, I haven't seen you for the last few days. Where were you?" He says, "Oh, I was crawling about on the dry land." And the fish says, "Oh, is it nice in the dry land? Is it wet? Can you swim in it?" No, it's just, it's dry, there's no water, you just crawl around on the surface. And they go back and forth. The fish can't possibly imagine what the experience of crawling about in the dry land is. It's totally beyond his imagination. Another image that the Buddha uses himself in one of his discourses, talking about sense pleasures and the attachment to sense pleasures. Someone he was speaking to makes the objection, "Oh, I enjoy my sense pleasures so much I can't imagine giving them up." And the Buddha says, "Have you seen in the marketplace here in Varanasi, there's a leper that's always sitting in the marketplace begging, and his body's covered with weeping sores, and he has a little brazier of hot coals that he always keeps going beside himself, and every now and again he'll pick one up with a pair of tongs and push it into one of his sores to cauterize it. It gives him momentary relief. It burns off the rotten flesh and gives him momentary relief." And he said, "Yes, I've seen that sight." And the Buddha said, "Do you think if that leper were to be miraculously cured of his leprosy tomorrow and could walk away whole and clean, do you think he'd ever get nostalgic about his hot coals? Oh, I'd sure miss driving those hot coals into my wounds. So that was so much fun. That felt so good." No, he would not have any remorse or regret over the loss of his hot coals. He says that human beings are like the leper, and the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body are like the open weeping sores, and pleasant sense objects are like the hot coals. If you don't like a metaphor that's so grisly as gruesome as that one, an obvious one is the attachment a small child has to its toys. When you yourself were 3 or 4 years old, you probably had some special toy that you loved at that moment, a red truck or whatever it might be, and you couldn't imagine living without it. If you misplaced it and lost it, you'd cry half the day until your mom found it for you. But now that you're grown and you probably don't even remember what your favorite toy was at the time, and if it was brought in front of you, have very little interest in it. You might look at it as a curiosity. Oh, that's what toys look like in the 1960s. Okay, but you wouldn't have any desire to play with it or keep it. It was the most important thing in your day at one time. And this is, as a child, couldn't imagine doing without it. The adult has no interest in it. So the mind that's resting in the level of the realm of form has no interest in sense objects. They just seem completely irrelevant to that mind. They're like the toys that have been left behind, or like the leper's hot coals. And this allows the mind to experience a deeper level of happiness that's not imaginable to the mind that's limited to the sense sphere only. Just as the fish cannot imagine the dry land. The tortoise can't possibly imagine the condition of a bird soaring through the sky. And the mind that experiences Nibbana is, again, something on another level of unimaginability, the second order, actually a fourth order, because there's the realm of formless in between. So happiness is something that's classed as an enlightenment factor. It's something that's useful and positive. But to be, not to imagine or think that the only or the best source of happiness is that which is experienced through the senses. This is a very limited form of happiness.
Handamayam Dhammakataya Sadhu Karam Dharamase Sadhu 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 Anumodam.